Welcome to this episode of Hessian Scrum. Joining me today is Mark and Daniel from Australian death metal slash brutal death metal band Neuropath, who just had their both early demos reissued as one compilation by Sphere of Apparition Records at Damnation Score. You can find the review on our website. So it's great to have you guys.
Thanks, man. Good to be here.
Yeah, great to be here. Thank you.
So let's start with the question. So, at the time in Australia, obviously there were quite a few metal bands, but like no one was trying to play that kind of what I'd call like almost technical kind of metal. All of it was very kind of raw black stuff and very kind of rowdy, whereas you guys were trying to do something a bit more American.
Yeah, look, I think that's fair to say. Some of that non-conformance to what else was going on in Australia comes down to the fact that we were so young. So we actually didn't have access to what else was going on in Australia when we first met, and just had to pick up the influences from what we heard around us. And that was the American death metal sound at the time. It would only be progressively as we sort of got involved with the scene that we'd start to become influenced by the rest of the scene around us. And we were also in a fairly isolated pocket of Sydney in the Northern Beaches region, which had no real understanding of what death metal was. There was no other bands. There was very few other death metal bands in Sydney as a whole. Melbourne and Canberra tended to be where, Brisbane to a lesser extent, where you found most of the death metal at the time. So we just kind of tried to make something that we enjoyed listening to and something that we were capable of playing at the time as well. And it just happened to be a sound that I think you're correct. I don't think there was anyone pushing that brutality level quite as far as we did with those two demos at the time.
Nefarious Vivisection, it's weird. For a first demo, it's surprisingly clean for that time. Everything's precise, well rehearsed, everything. Like, it sounds like a lot of bands, like bigger bands, is full lengths at the time.
Yeah, I kind of see it a bit differently when I listen back to it. But because we were kind of learning how to play at the same time, I wrote those songs the majority of it would have been written in 1993 when I was 17. The other band members, I think when we first got together, the other guitarist was 14 or 15. And the drummer, and Mark was, what were you, 16, Mark?
Yeah, 16, 15, 16.
So we played the shit out of that stuff early on, and we played quite a few gigs locally, and we were really across the material, but we were still kind of pushing some of the band members' technical skills a little bit, and we had to practice it a lot. So I think that shows in it. And also when we went into the studio, we had no idea what we were doing. We didn't know exactly what we needed to do. We went into a studio with a guy producing, well, no, it wasn't produced, mixing, that had never heard death metal before, didn't know how to produce it. And it's just kind of a fumbling mess for how that all ends up in the end. We went back and did the second demo with the same people in the same studio, and he had a better understanding. But I can still remember, I don't know if you remember this, Mark, I can still remember rocking up to record the second demo tape, and Sean, who was mixing it, said, "What do you want it to sound like?" And I think we played him Effigy of the Forgotten, and he listened to it and went, "Are you serious? Do you really want it this compressed?" And went, "Oh yeah, totally." So it was kind of just coincidence about how that all sounded, but there was a lot of effort and a lot of rehearsal time in people's basements and bedrooms to get it to sound like that.
Anywhere where we could find, in the studio, in the basement, downstairs, lots of parents pulling their hair out and leaving. It was just constant. It was just practice, 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 practice.
I would say the second demo was much tighter because of the live experience that we had by that stage. We got a lot of gigs off the back of the first demo, and we obviously upped the technicality, but we had more confidence in ourselves. We'd matured a little bit as people. We'd seen a bunch of people playing live that we hadn't had exposure to before. All those sorts of things helped to make that second demo. It's just incredible. It's only 10 months apart. But admittedly, the first demo was, we already had some of that stuff written before the first demo. The first one was kind of a purging of the old stuff. We always intended to record the newer stuff, and we wanted to get the older stuff out there so that we could focus on our newer sound, which was more technical and more brutal, really.
I mean, you know, the first one obviously shows that, like, you know, you guys were listening to a lot of you know, the older albums of a lot of the classic American bands, you know, are still very Slayer inspired. You know, obviously, you know, I think all 4 songs had a Slayer breakdown in the middle, right, and everything. And like the earlier Obituary, Death, and you know, Deicide.
That's fair to say. I think Anthony Watson, the original guitar player, and I, we kind of first met, and Anthony kind of brought Mark and Luke and Barney into the band, and he was very young at the time and had only just got into death metal, so he was still listening to the Slayers and Creators, and I came from a background of growing up with that, so I learned to play extreme metal through playing, like, Slayers, as far as I'm concerned, the greatest thing ever. So it was always going to influence it. But I would say if I had to pick the bands that were like the ones that everyone loved when we first got together, it was Deicide, Obituary, and Cannibal Corpse, I would say.
Definitely Cannibal Corpse. I mean, that's where the lyrics were inspired from. Butchered at Birth, in particular, for the first demo.
And definitely, I mean, and you know, also what I always loved about, you know, death metal about that era is, like, despite all the aggression and the brutality, you know, the first demo is surprisingly catchy. You know,
it is. I think I was the only one that had actually played in a band before at the time, and I'd had several failed attempts of pulling together younger kids at school that liked extreme metal, but none of them were into death metal as such. So I remember I had the classic situation where I was playing in a band that kind of thought that they were evil and dark and wanted to be Deicide, but really didn't understand what that was about musically. And I was trying to bring in these elements of death metal, but really they just wanted to play basic thrash riffs. So they ended up doing the thing where they broke the band up and put it back together without me under a different name, which was fun. But I kind of grew up playing in those thrash bands because there was nothing else to play. And Neuropath was my first time where I actually pulled together some people that knew what death metal was. And Mark was he was obsessed with death metal when we first got the band together. I think that's fair to say.
Yeah, completely.
You know, what were people's reactions at the time? Because, you know, in America, people had already been doing extreme vocals for a long time, you know, and you're doing the kind of deep gurgling stuff in front of people who'd never heard that stuff, you know.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't anything new, but I strived for something that was more extreme than what we'd already heard, deeper, gruntier, and I got there. And some of that was practice. I know you people are sort of like, you know, how do you practice vocals? Well, you just do it. You just push yourself again and again and again and again, and it changes. Your vocal cords change. Everything changes. Now, for example, I couldn't even get close. It's out of practice. It's just how it is.
Mark, I was recently wondering, like, you were the guy that was up front doing that stuff. A lot of people could accept the music at the time and just struggled with the vocals of death metal.
Yeah.
Did you ever feel kind of embarrassed when at any gigs to get up and do it? We could see what the audience was. We knew what the response was going to be, or did you not care?
I did not care. I even remember there was like the odd heckle of like, "We can't understand you" from some drunken guy right up the back. And it just pushed me to do it more, to do sound checks in death metal growls. Like, yeah, it was good. It was a reaction. It was something that you got from the crowd, whether it was positive or negative. And I thrived on that reaction one way or another.
I can remember a gig we played at, I think it was Borkham Hills, and it was on like a weeknight or something, and they just booked any bands to play. And we were opening for a prog rock band that had some record label interest coming along to see them play. and we were playing before them, and them and the label and some of their friends and family and stuff had rocked up, and they had a limiter on the volume of
Oh
sound they could
yes,
have in
yeah,
the
I remember the
place.
place now. Yeah,
And,
yeah,
and we blew the limits of that on the first beat, and
yeah.
I can remember having to turn down, but I can remember like people's faces just being melted off by what they were hearing and just
Yeah,
not being able to fathom what was going on.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, how do you guys feel about death metal nowadays? Because it's borderline a mainstream thing, right? Bands with like a lot of very expensive stage presence, effects, big studios, big everything, and you guys did the absolute opposite.
I feel spoilt for choice. Um, it's become now what I always wish it had been, which is almost mainstream, but it's still not mainstream. So you don't get old Sally down the road who went to church and then came back and listened to death metal. It's still not quite there yet. So I'm I'm happy with that side of things. When it progresses to that level, I'm out. I'm done.
I mean, Cher, the singer, she actually invited Cannibal Corpse to do one of her birthday parties, and she told Corpse Grinder, "Honey, I've been death metal before you were even born."
I think that being in Australia is also a little bit different to being in Europe, for example. Um, there hasn't been a time when death metal has been something that very many people knew about, and particularly not in New South Wales, where we were originally from. Um, so I don't think that even in current day there's a big awareness of what it's all about. I love the scene in general. I've been a big part of that even since Neuropath through my Metal Academy brand with podcasts and website and things like that. But there's a common consensus in the field, in the scene, that things got too clinical and too technical and took away somewhat of the aura of the scene, and then we went to this regressive retro type of fad that's been going on for the last decade. But realistically, with the internet, there is so much out there, and you can find what you're after. And the fact that it is still so underground means that it's still got that excitement that we had when I was tape trading in the early 90s. It's just more accessible and easier to find and easier to communicate and cheaper, I guess.
All right, so let's move on to your second demo. Now that was like, well, not the biggest style change, but it was like a huge progression for you guys on every single point.
It was, and that was kind of a gradual thing. If you actually put all the songs on that demo, and there was a couple of others that didn't make the cut. There was two new ones that we never got to record, and there was also a long 10-minute Doom epic that we wrote early on. But I can see the progression from one to the next very clearly. What people probably don't know is that Copulation of Insanity, the third track on Desert of Excruciation, that was actually the second song that I ever wrote for Neuropath. But it sounded very different at the time, and we didn't actually think it was good enough for Nefarious Vivisection. And I rejigged it with the main riff and all the bits of lead, and changed the structure a bit and made it work for the second demo, and it's totally nothing like it. But I also see, when I listen to the three tracks on Desert of Excruciation, I can see that we're still progressing in a direction. They kind of were written in the reverse order that they play out, and the songs that we never got a chance to record were, again, more technical and more brutal than anything on that demo.
Considerably so.
Yeah, I mean, even lyrically, the lyrics are a lot more kind of evocative, a lot less, open your rectum kind of thing, Where
Yeah, it changed from imitation being flattery to just allowing myself to write what was pertinent to me at the time, to let my influences like H.P. Lovecraft, for example, start to bleed into the lyrics a little bit. And it was more fulfilling to me. I wasn't just repeating and changing the words from other albums like I had in the first demo. I was actually creating for a change. So yeah, the lyrics definitely did take a different turn.
Yeah, and you know what's interesting in the language of the second EP, especially on the first two songs. You know, there's quite a bit of like you know, talking about places. Like, is that you're referring to Australia? You know, when you talk about ivy moss and tombstones and the sea.
Again, just my imagination, just places where I would escape to, basically. Um, Classic imagery of you know, grim, haunted places. Um, a lot of the elemental imagery comes in with fire and ice. Um, all part of my imagination and what I was reading at the time and what captured me.
And you were quite reclusive at the time and sort of did your own thing with the own places you went in your head, didn't you?
Yeah, definitely. Being an angsty teenager, it's definitely influenced the writing to some extent. But yeah, it took me away when I was writing those lyrics. I was gone. It was almost not a deliberate creation. It was just a free flow. Um, and what ended up turning up is what you guys are reading now. There wasn't much rewriting and scribbling out of paragraphs and starting all over again. It was quite straightforward, not effortless, but very close to being so.
Hmm. You know, also we see like the kind of really interesting technique that you used on the second EP, which wasn't really that popular in death metal at the time. But you know, the clean guitars, the more kind of ethereal sounding stuff, you know, especially on Incantations of Decrepit Nihilism.
Look, I was massively into the scene and massively into tape trading for the first half of the night, like probably until Neuropath sort of called it a day. So I was into all sorts of stuff at the time, and I can hear all of those influences in those tracks. So my Bleeding Mortality, that middle section, I can definitely hear that I was listening to a lot of Norwegian black metal like Burzum and the likes. But I would say for the first demo, when we first got the band together, those influences that I mentioned were kind of the unified influences of the band. But I was kind of getting into the more brutal end of death metal and the more technical end of death metal at the time, but we kind of weren't in a position to be playing it as a band. So I always intended to head in that direction and to incorporate elements out of the other more extreme sounds that I was hearing. And it just took some time. So that's why it seemed like the inevitable outcome. Incantations of Decrepit Nihilism was the eventual goal, and I probably would have done something like that from the start if we could have all played it. But I'm really proud with how tight that sounds because I can remember where we started, and it certainly advanced when we brought some additional members into the band that had a bit more exposure and a bit more age behind them. But we would. It might seem a little bit disappointing that we kind of didn't see the next couple of tracks recorded and we didn't get to where we were wanting to go eventually. But when I look at all of the scenarios around what could have happened and where we were all at personally, it kind of seemed like it played out the way it was meant to. Mark, would you agree?
Yeah, for sure.
I mean, you know, obviously the big question. You guys were obviously at that level to have had at least one full length, and it never materialized.
We certainly had conversations with Warhead, but look, I think that the reason that it didn't materialize is because we were very isolated with what we were doing. We didn't actually think that we were ready for that. when we hear all these reviews and things online that are all really positive, it kind of doesn't align with what I remember from where we were at. We were still playing gigs for 5 people and struggling to get respect because we were so young in the scene. People need to understand that I was the only one that was overage for most of the time the band was together. I think Ali was just 19, maybe, when we did the second demo. The rest of the guys were still 16 and 17. So it was all very new to us. We were hanging out with older people, but the level of respect that was coming back for us, people weren't telling us that from the other bands and the labels and things that are around that we should go and do this. It was only after we did that second demo that people started going, you know what? Why didn't you master this? And neither of the demos were mastered at the time. Why didn't you invest in doing a full length? Because this is good stuff. And we're like, it never even occurred to us. We didn't even think that was where we were going to get to eventually. We just thought, oh, we'll do a few demos because that's how big a band we are at the moment.
I know it's crazy because, you know, the thing that struck me the most about both those demos is that as a band, you genuinely had your own identity. Like you weren't just copying what everyone else was doing. Like, obviously, you know, we can hear the slams from Legion of Inveracity and, you know, all that stuff, and the early brutal stuff that came just after Suffocation. But like, Neuropath doesn't sound like any other band. Like, that's what was really interesting to me.
That was important.
I'm really excited.
Yeah, that was definitely important to us, to not just be mimicking what had come before us. We wanted to create something new. We wanted to be a new band, not just homage.
I didn't want us to be a riffs band. I wanted us to be a band that put together the songs in a way that flowed, but could go for a whole different gamut of places. And I would obviously write all the bits and pieces as riffs, but I focused a lot on what other bands that were professional were doing, about how they would put it all together. And still, I could hear some were still pasting it together in a pretty haphazard way, and people didn't seem to notice. But for me, I really wanted it to sound fluent. And as we started to play more live gigs, that seemed to make a really big difference on the impact that we'd have with some of the live shows. I actually don't think people are aware that people used to say that we were better live than we were on the cassettes, particularly on the first cassette. I don't think it sounds as tight as we were live at times, because we put a lot of effort into that. And towards the end of the band, we started to really work on the visual aspect as well. The little details we started to work on, you know, what are we going to wear? How are we going to throw ourselves around the stage? What facials are we going to put on? What's the image we want to portray? That kind of stuff. So it was, I guess it's about attention to detail, and that sort of got a greater and greater priority as we started to become more exposed to bigger bands and the scene.
Did you guys ever feel the need to go back and to make music now?
I do every day, but I have a lot going on in my life, and like, you're probably not aware, but after I did Neuropath, I did another bunch of stuff in different areas. I just love music. I don't tend to stay in the one place for too long these days, but metal's kind of the one that never drifts. But I was a techno DJ through the 2000s. I did a guitar shred CD, sort of like a Joe Satriani, Steve Vai kind of thing, in the late 90s, that I played and recorded all of the instruments myself. Once I kind of came back to really being full-time on metal around 2009, I wanted to become involved with the scene, but realized that playing in a band was something that I couldn't give my whole self to, because of I have a fairly high profile job. I've got other things going on. So I became involved with the scene in other ways through the Metal Academy brand. and that's been enough to fulfill me, I guess, talking to people about metal, sharing the great stuff that I hear, and discussing it with like-minded people around the world.
Yeah, metal for life for me, constantly. But just it's had to take a second place, unfortunately. Like Daniel, it's life. There's just so many other things that have squeezed their way in: work, kids, houses, mortgages, all the terrible, terrible things. But always metal, always metal.
So yeah, you guys were saying that, talking about the Sydney scene. So what was that like at the time?
I think it's important to understand how that scene was at the time if you're going to understand why a band like Neuropath wouldn't have gone further than we did, and why we were still relatively unknown when we ended the band. Sydney did have some big bands in the grand scheme of Australian metal over time, like leading up to when we got together. There was the Mortal Sins and the Sadistic Executions, the Slaughter Lords, those sorts of bands. But when we kind of got together in '93, a band like Cruciform that was considerably big in Australia was kind of just sort of peaked and coming to an end when we were starting to get bigger. And all the other bands in the Sydney scene were relatively small. When we looked at the Australian scene, there was a bunch of really decent bands in Melbourne. There was the Disembowelments, the Bestial Warlast, Paramecium, Mortification, Horde, Destroyer 666, all that sort of stuff. Abramelin. Brisbane, you had your Miseries, and you had Armored Angel and Alchemist and Psychrist and stuff in Canberra. We really didn't have something similar in Sydney. And when we started playing more gigs, we were supporting bands that weren't on that same status. And then once we started headlining, we were playing with bands that were smaller than us. So it was really, I don't know if you've heard of Lord Chaos from the black metal side, but they were probably the most significant band in the Sydney up and coming scene at the time. And we ended up playing a lot with them. And they ended up doing a full length and getting a few supports and things. But it was hard to break out of that scene because there wasn't a lot going on in and around Sydney at the time. And when we used to get those bands coming up from Melbourne or Canberra, which happened all the time, often there would be a support from Canberra or Melbourne as well. Or it would be the same bands kind of getting the same supports all the time. So it was a challenge. And when we also talk about Warhead Records, Warhead was located in Sydney, and it was based around a metal store out west of Sydney called the Hammer House, which was very, very small. We're talking about like the size of your bathroom type metal store. And releasing a demo, what it means to release a demo on Warhead was we did our first demo. The label liked that first demo. They said, if you do another demo, come to us and we'll release it. We went, planned, recorded the demo, planned how the cover was going to look, put it all together, and presented it to the label who put their name on it. And we then waited, I don't know, an immeasurable amount of time. It seemed like a lifetime for it to actually get released. But I think it was somewhere up towards 6 months before it actually came out. And by that stage, our candle had kind of burned, and had that come out straight away, we might have been able to capitalize on it a lot more. But it was still such a small time thing in the grand scheme of death metal globally at the time.
No, it's really is a shame considering, Parmesium that you mentioned, what an underrated death doom band. Disembowelment, reached legendary status within like the last decade. People have taken notice of them and everything, and now Neuropath.
So the scene was so small at the time, and that I was tape trading with Mournful Congregation and Damaged and picking up the demos from Disembowelment and stuff by mail order, and it was very insular. and the only way we were communicating was that by mail and that kind of thing. So it wasn't like there was this group of bands that were worshipped in our country. It wasn't like that. I mean, Sadistic obviously had this aura around them in Sydney, but when you got together with them and met them and hung out with them like I did, you just found that they were just guys that just want to have fun, you know. And they didn't think of themselves that way, despite the image that they would kind of portray, which I think is kind of cool.
We are deaf. Fuck you. That's a funny demo.
It's funny when I think of that, and I think of having Dave Slave over for a cup of tea at my place. Lovely guy, by the way.
They did an interview for fairly big printed zine called Bardo Methodology, and the way they portrayed themselves, like they will, like it sounds like they'll kill you if you even like look at them the wrong way.
There was a lot of bands like that in the Australian scene, and it kind of gave our little scene over here a notoriety around that black and death thrash kind of sound. But again, all just scallywags having a bit of fun and drinking too much and doing stupid shit.
Now, let's go back to Desert of Excruciation. What I really enjoy about that, it's like, during that time period, like brutal death metal wasn't so much as this kind of very identifiable thing. It was still it was just a bunch of death metal bands trying to get more extreme, trying to be a bit more serious with their composition, with the vocals even more extreme and everything. And when you see what it's become now, where it's kind of like a joke thing, right? Like, do you feel that it hasn't evolved in the right way? Because you guys were there from like the start of brutal death metal.
I absolutely do. It was a seriously exciting thing for me. Suffocation were probably still my favorite band, and they're a very special band for me because I kind of got to them from right at the start. Those bands you have where you just happen to stumble over the demo and you took them through your whole lifetime. They're one of those bands for me, and I think that we've got too obsessed with labels over time. I think we really want to be able to pigeonhole all the bands into whatever they are, like a brutal or a technical or a slam or whatever it is. But back then, it was just about playing what you liked. And in my early tape trading days, I picked up that despite the fact that my favorite bands were like Morbid Angel and Slayer and that type of thing, I still found that when I wanted to express myself through metal, I was attracted to that more extreme Suffocation, Cannibal Corpse, Cryptopsy, early Mortician, Pyrexia. And I kind of sought out that sound through tape trading, and I picked up like demos from Internal Bleeding and Disgorge and Dying Fetus at the time. And that was all something that I was doing while I was still playing the early stuff with Neuropath and thinking to myself, how do I incorporate these things into our sound? Because this is the direction I feel like suits me the best and suits Mark certainly down to the ground. The direction that Luke was going with his drumming as well over time.
Yeah, and we weren't being extreme for extreme's sake. That extremity, it almost didn't even enter the picture. It was the creativity that fueled us more than anything else. Whereas, like you were saying, nowadays there's a lot of bands that get their sound and their lyrics and their vocals to just be more extreme than the bands that have come before them. And they lack a little soul, they lack a little spirit. It's just the extremity of the bands that counts now, rather than the creativity.
I mean, everyone can play ridiculously well these days in brutal death metal. There's no doubt about that. But
Yeah,
it's not necessarily what makes for the best outcome. I think it's also interesting that despite the fact that I would write all the music and Mark would write all the lyrics, the other band members who were much younger were important in the roles that they played in how we got to the outcome. So someone like Anthony Watson, who was so young, he kind of encouraged me to push things when I was, say, going in a direction that was like purely brutal and technical and this kind of stuff, and being encouraged to go in that way by other people. He was kind of going, I really like this melodic thing that you've come up with. Can we expand on that? How about we try something different with the drums there? He was also really instrumental in how we put together the packaging for the demos and the imagery and that kind of thing. Everyone kind of played their role. When Ali joined the band as our bass player, he kind of started. When I look at that first demo, I can see that we kind of let Luke do what he did on the drums. No one really kind of challenged him and said, try this. What if you put the roll here? What if we change this? He kind of did what he did. I did what I did. And I taught him how to play what he chose to play, and he did it well. But then once we got Ali in the band, he started challenging him and saying, look, I'm hearing guys do this type of thing. What if we try that? And then that extended further once we got our eventual guitarist, Frank, involved as well, who was a very good technical rhythm guitar player and allowed us to sort of stretch into other directions. Again, had great pedigree in metal and understood that songwriting is just as important as the brutality in the riffs.
Just a disclaimer, that was not all new metal bands that I was talking about when I said pushing through. Just put that in now, so every band that hears this isn't like, that fucking arrogant Aussie guy, what the hell?
I don't know. I think you meant it that way, mate. I took it that
writing them all off. You're all done.
I'm already getting emails.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not a big issue. You know, a lot of these bands pride themselves on doing the stupidest things and just, you know, collecting the hate comments. So, you know, it is what it is. I don't know.
It is what it is.
But yeah, you know, I mean, I've always felt that with brutal death metal nowadays. You know, I'm not going to name the band, but I saw a band with a female singer, you like brutal death metal band with a female singer, and she's like in a bra and short shorts, just, you know, twerking on stage. I'm like, okay, this isn't really what I want from that kind of music, but to each their own, right?
Yeah.
Mark used to do that too, though.
Yeah. All right. So, you know, you got in touch with Jason from Sphere of Apparition Records, you know, and after all this time has passed, like, what made you kind of, you know, agree and put the effort to get the, you know, At Damnation's Core out?
Look, it was certainly always something that I'm guessing Mark and I both always regretted, that we never kind of mastered and released the material. But I kind of just put it into the past and moved on. Jason contacted me out of the blue, and the way that he presented it to me was that he and some of the people around him were big fans, and that the demo tapes had played a big role in their earlier lives. And he forwarded some of the links to online correspondence on YouTube and other places with many people, some of them current bands in Australia, that were talking about the fact that they were influential and important to them. And I actually had no idea, because I hadn't thought about going chasing and Googling to see what people thought at this point. I was just kind of proud of what we did. So I don't think there was ever a hesitation. When he said he wanted to release them, I said, go for it. The first problem came up when he said, can I get a copy of the master tapes? Because I had no idea where they were, and I pulled my house to pieces. I've moved several times since then, and I could not find them. So we had to work with what we had. And I think Bjorn, who did the mastering, has done an amazing job at bringing out the elements that we needed to from working with what he had there.
Yeah, definitely. You know, I did get to hear the you know, unremastered stuff, and it's a shame, especially on the demo. A lot of your solos tend to like disappear from the mix. Some really cool stuff going in. You know, you avoided a lot of the kind of, you know, as much as I love you know, Jeff Hanneman, Kerry King, you don't do the kind of wow stuff that they were spamming at the time.
No, I kind of appreciate that more than I guess idolize that. I mean, King and Hanneman were absolutely massive for me at the time, but I always appreciated something a little bit more melodic. I mean, my favorite guitar players are not death metal guitar players. I'm obsessed with people like George Lynch, for example, or John Petrucci, and they all have this melodic edge to them. I was listening to Joe Satriani a lot, for example, and always wanted to make my solos something that you could remember, something that you could hum along to. That got less so as we progressed, though. I think towards the end, I was working with the fact that we were playing a lot more live, and people at death metal gigs at the time wanted to see something more visual. So I was actually consciously making my solos something that could look impressive on stage as well. Not necessarily hard to play, but something that just looked exciting.
Yeah, that did change for all of us, the stage presence. There started being more spiked gauntlets and leather pants and medallions and all of that sort of stuff. It definitely did change from starting out in flannels in the back garage.
I mean, I think that's the first time I'd ever see a brutal death metal band with like the spiked gauntlets and the leather pants, you know. Suffocation weren't dressed like that, it was all like loose fitting t-shirts and baggy jeans.
Yeah. No, we had that, but we just started, I don't know. We started getting more confidence in our stage presence, I think.
All right, I think we've gone through about everything, so I've got, 2 final questions. So I know you're both Slayer and Suffocation fans. All right, so South of Heaven or Rain in Blood?
South of Heaven.
Rain in Blood. Rain in Blood is not just my favorite record, it's my favorite thing, I would say.
This one's a bit harder. So, what was it? Effigy of the Forgotten, Breeding the Spawn, or Pierced from Within?
Effigy.
Pierced
These
from
are two
Within.
questions.
Pierced from Within to me is the culmination of everything that brutal death metal should be. I love the brutality of Effigy, and it changed my life when I first heard it.
Yeah, same. It's so raw.
But I loved the slightly more technical side to Pierce from Within, the cleaner production, the fact that the vocals were so brutal yet more intelligible, I actually appreciated. I think that the first 5 or 6 tracks on that CD that's me right there. That's what I think death metal should be.
Yeah, I mean, it is a perfect, all early Suffocation is perfect, and I won't hear any other slander against it.
Indeed.
Agree. The only thing that could ever stop Suffocation was production.
Yeah, it was a shame what happened to Breeding the Spawn.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Any closing statements?
Look, I just want to thank everyone that's given a little bit of attention to this stuff that we did when we were teenagers. It was our whole lives at the time, and we kind of put it in the past, but we're just really excited that it can still be heard by people around the world. And if anyone gets anything out of it, then fantastic. Don't mind if everyone reaches out to us, because we enjoy hearing about it and hearing people's stories and sharing. So thanks a lot to yourself, Nicholas.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thanks to everyone. Metal for life, metal for death.
All right. Have a good day. Enjoy.
See ya.
Thank you.